Hey everyone, ready to dive into something pretty fascinating. We're tackling college admissions today, and specifically Stanford University. You sent over some articles, and honestly, some of this stuff is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's a hot topic for sure. I mean, Stanford's reputation precedes it. Everyone wants to know the secret formula, right?
Right, and get this. Between 2008 and 2013, Stanford rejected 69% of applicants with perfect SAT scores. Perfect score. You'd think that's a golden ticket.
It's crazy, isn't it? But perfect scores are becoming more and more common these days, especially at those top-tier schools. It's almost like it's just the bare minimum now, not the guarantee it used to be.
Yeah, it's like, you've mastered the basics, but that doesn't make you a virtuoso. So if scores aren't everything, what are these universities really looking for?
Well, Stanford and a lot of other elite schools use what they call holistic evaluation. They're trying to look beyond just the numbers, to see the whole person, the intellectual vitality, as they call it.
I read about that,
Yeah.
but honestly, it feels a little bit vague, right? How do you measure intellectual vitality? What does that even mean?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? One of the articles mentioned that they look for evidence of it in everything. Extracurriculars, essays, recommendations, interviews. They gave some examples of students who really stood out. Musicians, athletes, community activists. One student even started a nonprofit in high school.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But it also makes the whole process even more competitive.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If even half of the top students from half of the high schools in the country applied to Stanford, that's already thousands of incredibly talented kids all vying for the same limited spots.
Oh, absolutely. The competition is fierce. And then there's another factor that always adds fuel to the fire: legacy admissions.
Ah, yes. The legacy factor, like this hidden advantage that not everyone has access to.
Exactly. And Stanford's no exception, unfortunately. Their legacy acceptance rate is about 3 times higher than the general rate.
3 times.
Wow.
That's a huge difference. I mean, I get the arguments for it, building a strong alumni network, encouraging donations, but it just feels unfair to those who don't have that family connection.
I agree. It raises questions about whether these institutions are truly committed to creating a diverse and inclusive environment, or if they're more focused on maintaining a certain status quo.
And it's not just a Stanford thing, right? Legacy preference seems like it's deeply embedded in a lot of these top schools.
Absolutely. And this all ties into the bigger picture of how college admissions have evolved over time. It's a whole different ballgame than it was even a generation ago.
So what's changed? What's driving this intense competition?
Well, for one thing, the rise of college rankings has put immense pressure on both students and universities. Everyone's chasing those top spots, which creates a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. Rankings drive applications, and applications drive rankings.
So it becomes this arms race for prestige. Everyone's trying to outdo each other.
Exactly. And then you add in factors like increased financial aid and the ease of applying to multiple schools online. Students can apply to a dozen or more schools now with just a few clicks, which further inflate application numbers.
So even if more people are applying, the class sizes aren't necessarily getting bigger, which makes it even harder to get accepted anywhere.
Exactly. And this has really forced admissions offices to adapt. They've had to move away from simple formulas and rely more on these committees and these nuanced assessments to try and sift through this huge pool of applicants.
So they're going for this holistic approach,
Right.
but it still feels like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. I mean, how can you truly capture an applicant's potential based on a few essays and a transcript?
It's an imperfect system for sure. And that's where things can get really tricky, especially when you consider stories like Bill Shirley's, which we read about in one of the articles.
Well, like Bill Shirley, the Stanford alum, whose son was denied admission even with a strong application. That story really hit home for me. It speaks to the emotional roller coaster that comes with these high-stakes decisions and the lingering questions about fairness.
Absolutely. His story really highlights the complexities of the legacy system and the human impact it has on individuals and families. What I found particularly compelling was his journey from bitterness and resentment to a place of acceptance.
It's almost like his experience challenges our assumptions about what a fair outcome should look like. Makes you wonder if there's more to it than just getting that acceptance letter.
Definitely raises some important questions about what we value in education and what success really means. Makes you wonder, are we placing too much emphasis on these brand name institutions? Are we overlooking other pathways that might be just as valuable?
It's like we've created this hierarchy where certain universities are seen as golden tickets, not just to a good education, but to a certain social status, a network of connections, a guarantee of future success.
And that raises the question, is that really the case? Is it really a guarantee? Or are we buying into a myth?
Feels like a myth to me. And even if it's true, should it be that way? Shouldn't everyone have the opportunity to pursue their dreams and reach their full potential, regardless of their background or where they go to school?
That's a great point. And it brings us back to the idea of intellectual vitality. It's not something that's confined to the walls of a prestigious university. It's about a love of learning, a curiosity about the world, and a drive to make a difference no matter where you end up going to school.
As we're talking about all this, I keep thinking about that statistic. We started with 69% of applicants with perfect SAT scores getting rejected from Stanford. Makes you wonder, what's the point of striving for perfection if it doesn't even guarantee you a spot?
It's a great question, and it leads to a bigger discussion about the value of standardized testing. Is it truly an accurate measure of potential? Are there other more meaningful ways to assess a student's abilities and their likelihood to succeed?
And if even perfect scores aren't enough, what should be the defining factors for college admissions? What would a truly equitable and holistic process look like?
These are tough questions, but I think it's important that we're having this conversation. We need to keep pushing for a more equitable and accessible education system that values individual potential over pedigree or privilege.
I completely agree. And for you listening in, this is where things get really interesting. We've just scratched the surface of this complex issue, and we want to hear your thoughts. What stands out to you about this whole college admissions puzzle? What are your thoughts on the role of standardized tests, the legacy factor, and the pursuit of those brand name institutions? We'll continue this conversation after a quick break.
It's really interesting to think about how much we focus on those big name universities when there are so many other great colleges and universities out there.
Yeah. It's like we get tunnel vision,
Yeah.
fixated on those top-ranked schools. But there are so many hidden gems out there, places that might be a perfect fit for someone, even if they don't have that Ivy League name. It makes you wonder how we define success in education.
Right, exactly. And it reminds me of something we talked about earlier about Bill Shirley. Even though his son wasn't accepted to Stanford, he eventually came to terms with that decision. It says a lot about perspective, doesn't it?
Yeah. His story really resonated with me, too. It reminds us that what we might see as a setback can actually open doors to new opportunities, maybe even better ones. It challenges us to rethink what success means and to consider different paths.
It's not just about going to a different college either. It's about realizing that the traditional four-year college route isn't the only way to a fulfilling and successful life. There's a growing interest in trade schools, apprenticeships, and other educational models that focus on specific skills and passions.
Absolutely. We need to move past this idea that everyone needs the same kind of education and recognize that people have different talents and interests. It's about empowering people to find their own unique path to success.
That's such a great point. And that's where I think intellectual vitality really comes in, even outside of a traditional academic setting. It's about that desire to learn, that drive to grow and learn no matter what you're passionate about.
I love that. It's not just about the school or the degree. It's about that mindset of lifelong learning and curiosity.
Exactly. And I think that's something we often forget in all this college admissions frenzy. We get so caught up in the rankings and the prestige that we lose sight of the real purpose of education, which is to ignite our passions, broaden our horizons, and give us the skills to make a difference.
Absolutely. So maybe we can shift gears a little and talk about what we can actually do to make this system a bit more fair, a bit more focused on individual potential.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think we need to start by rethinking standardized tests. We've already seen that perfect SAT scores don't guarantee admission, and there's more and more research suggesting these tests might not be the best way to predict future success.
There's a lot of discussion about whether these tests really measure intelligence or just how good you are at taking tests. And they can be so stressful, especially for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who might not have the same resources or opportunities to prepare.
Exactly. So maybe we need to look at other ways to assess academic potential, ways that are more holistic, and consider a broader range of skills and experiences. Some colleges are trying out portfolio-based admissions, where students show their work and projects instead of just relying on scores and grades.
That's interesting. It puts the focus on what the student can actually do and what they've achieved, not just on memorizing facts and formulas.
Exactly. And it allows them to show off their creativity, critical thinking skills, and problem-solving abilities, which are probably more important for success in today's world.
I'm also curious about your thoughts on the legacy factor. It's obviously a controversial topic with strong arguments on both sides. But if we're serious about making the system more fair, I think we need to be honest about legacy preferences.
I agree. I think we need to look at why these preferences exist. Universities often say they're important for alumni loyalty and donations, but is that a good enough reason to give some applicants an advantage?
It feels like it just keeps a cycle of privilege going, where access and opportunity are passed down through families. It makes you wonder if there are other ways to keep alumni involved and get financial support without making the admissions process unfair.
I think there are definitely other options. Some universities are focusing on need-based financial aid to attract a more diverse student body. And there are programs to help students from underrepresented backgrounds navigate the application process and get ready for college.
Those sound great. It's about leveling the playing field and making sure everyone has a fair chance. And I think that's what we're all aiming for. A system that recognizes and supports talent and potential no matter where you come from or what your circumstances are.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to what we set out to do in this deep dive, to understand the complexities of college admissions and what it really takes to get into a place like Stanford. We've learned that it's about so much more than just grades and test scores. It's about intellectual curiosity, passion, and a willingness to embrace challenges and explore new things.
We've also talked about the things that make it harder for some students to get into college, and how we need a fairer and more holistic approach to admissions. And even though we focused on Stanford, these conversations apply to colleges and universities all over the country.
You're right. These are national conversations about access opportunity and the future of education. It's about helping people find their own path to success no matter where they go to school.
And thinking about all that, I want to leave you, our listener, with one last question to think about.
Yeah.
If we could start over and create a whole new college admissions system, what would it look like? What would be most important? And how could we make sure everyone has a fair chance to succeed? It's a lot to consider. But I think by talking about these things and challenging the way things are, we can create a fair system that benefits everyone, not just a select few. You know, it's kind of wild when you think about it. We're trying to make this system fair and objective, but we're dealing with something as complex as human potential.
Right. Trying to measure something that you can't really put into numbers.
Yeah, and we're basing these huge decisions on just a tiny glimpse of someone's life. No wonder things aren't perfect.
It's a bit like trying to predict the weather. You can have all the data in the world, but there are always going to be surprises.
Exactly, and that's what's so powerful about Bill Shirley's story. It shows us that sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them.
Yeah, his story is really about resilience and adapting. It's not just about getting into one specific school. It's about having that drive to succeed no matter what life throws at you.
And being open to different possibilities. Embracing the journey, even if it takes you in a different direction than you thought.
That's a great message for our listeners. Don't be afraid to make your own path and decide what success means to you.
Love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Stanford admissions, what are some of the key things we've learned? Well, first, even a perfect SAT score isn't a guarantee anymore. The competition is fierce, and holistic evaluation makes things even more complicated.
We also talked about the legacy factor, which is still a big debate. Is it fair? Is it equitable? And we looked at how college rankings and online applications have made things even more competitive.
But maybe the most important thing we talked about is this. We need to think bigger about what success means. There are so many ways to live a fulfilling and meaningful life.
It's about finding what you're passionate about, developing your skills, and making a difference in the world. It doesn't matter where you went to school or what degree you have.
So to all of you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on college admissions. It's a complicated issue, but by talking about it and questioning the way things are done, we can create a system that's fairer and works for everyone. Thanks for joining us.